You want one?
These things? Nice. Okay.
Very good. Do you want me to click the slides or?
We'll work out.
Yeah.
Make up the slides. Hey everyone, my name's Nick. I'm the co-founder of Sempo. Sempo is a tech startup that's looking to use blockchain to create financial inclusion, especially focused on markets that are currently very underserved by existing processes.
Hi everyone, my name is Sandra Hart. I work for Oxfam as the Pacific Cash and Livelihoods lead. I'm a disaster preparedness and response professional, and I'm trying to integrate blockchain into my work to do the same things that Nick said, but also to really accelerate the delivery process for humanitarian assistance, to engage communities in that process, and to make it more transparent.
So together, Oxfam and Sempo ran the world's first ever cryptocurrency-based cash aid program earlier this year. So this talk is basically going to be diving into a bit of that. We're actually talking about this at DevCon as well. So we figured we'd run this a little bit separately. It's a smaller group, so we thought it'd be really nice to have it more conversational. So we're going to do a quick overview of the program, how it went, answer a couple of the questions that come up all the time, and then jump straight into a more of a Q&A thing. Does that sound good? Getting some nods? Nice, okay.
All right, so let's talk about why and where we ran this pilot. So we ran this pilot in the very remote South Pacific country of Vanuatu. It's deep in the South Pacific Ocean, as you can see. And this was quite deliberate. We've got an ongoing disaster preparedness program there, so we were able to embed the pilot in something that was actually happening. Vanuatu is also the world's most disaster-prone country. Consistently, I think we're at 3 years in a row now. And what that means is that for people in Vanuatu, it's not a question of if, it's a question of when. That being said, the Pacific community, all of the islands in this area, remain on the margins of financial inclusion, the types of payment instruments we're familiar with, as well as on the margins of the global humanitarian community and the way that communities affected by disasters are marginalized. So we deliberately tested in that environment because it was a good stress test, but it was also filling a critical gap that the humanitarian sector currently struggles with.
So let's just take a step back for a second and talk cash aid, because it's a phrase we've used, I think, like twice now, and probably is worth mentioning. So cash aid is this idea that instead of giving people stuff when you want to help vulnerable people, you should just give them money. The reason this is so effective is because, generally speaking, we're pretty terrible at working out what people need during a crisis. So 70% of Syrian refugees have sold the aid they've been given to buy what they actually need. So basically, the idea is to skip this whole process of giving people stuff to pawn off and then get money to buy what they want and just give them money in the first place. The problem is that actually getting money to people in a crisis is somewhat of a difficult process, especially when you've got people who have basically no access to bank accounts. And so you hear stories of NGOs who ship money on a boat up a river because it's less likely to be ambushed than if they drive a car. These are the sort of realities you face when trying to get financial inclusion to heavily underbanked people in complex regions. And so this is something we think blockchain can basically provide a very effective way to address. And so this is the process we run. We give digital wallets, i.e. Ethereum wallets, to people who have otherwise no access to a bank account. And then we give them digital credits, which in this case is the stablecoin DAI, directly to that wallet. People can then go and spend these credits at partnered vendors. And then we repay the vendors using a traditional financial process. Or alternatively, because the vendors now have access to DAI, they can go and then sell that DAI using an open exchange, because DAI, as a $1 denominated stablecoin, is broadly recognized as being valued anywhere. So this basically reduces this overhead of trying to find ways of getting money from hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of individuals down to how to get money to a handful of stores. One really important thing for us is inclusivity. We're working with communities. There's, I think, 70% of people in Vanuatu have never used a smartphone before. And there's very limited internet. So we actually tie the blockchain wallets to a smart card. It looks like this. It's just got a little NFC chip inside it. And then we give the vendors a very, very cheap Android phone that's 10 years old that has a scanner in it. and that basically closes the loop. So that's how the system works. It's designed for maximum inclusivity. So we really want to generate these big networks of vendors. So we're not just focusing on the large vendors, but we get even the smallest little vendors in the community on board so that we can really try and keep the community flowing through with this money.
So just to build on that question around inclusivity. So we're really trying to break what the status quo is that is not working for some of these smaller communities globally. Not only are they financially excluded by the existing infrastructure and payment services, they're excluded by the types of services that are supposed to include them. So when you look at big humanitarian voucher programs, usually they're catering to larger vendors. So there are very few programs that are targeting microeconomies, community-level vendors that ultimately are the same vendors that are responsible for getting those communities back on track and recovering. Those are also the same vendors that are most trusted and most familiar to those end recipients. So trying to make sure that we're building tech that's really straddling that gap, but also making sure that inclusion is integrated from the point of piloting and building is really essential. Some of the outcomes of this pilot were, I think we were all surprised. When we announced that we were piloting something in Vanuatu, people were like, Vanua, where? And is it going to work? Is the internet going to go down? And the reality of it is when you operate in what is essentially a vacuum-filled gap of services, good solutions work pretty well. So we were able to integrate two extraordinarily long processes in humanitarian assistance, which are the registration process of verifying who you're going to give to, and the distribution process of handing out entitlements. So when this process was usually taking over an hour when you consider that it's done on multiple days over an extended period of time, we compressed it into less than 6 minutes, and that went down to less than 4 minutes in the second community. In a country like Vanuatu that has 83 islands and where it takes an extremely long time to deliver humanitarian assistance, this is a significant gain. So this is a 96% improvement. In terms of satisfaction, of course, the process of giving cash to beneficiaries instead of goods is nothing new in the humanitarian sector, but it is absolutely new in the Pacific. That's how much on the margins it is. So compared to the first multi-purpose cash grant response in Vanuatu, satisfaction rates actually went up again through the use of this e-voucher. And this is actually comparing the receipt of these cards against the receipt of cash from cashing out a check at a bank. So it raises the question of whether hard currency is actually the preferred option if ease of use is being facilitated by a community network of vendors. And finally, setup time. Really working on an app that's easy to set up, that automates processes that are typically lengthy and time-consuming for NGOs means that we can drastically reduce response time. So that means the time that it takes from when a disaster hits to the moment that you're delivering entitlements in the community. And that also was reduced drastically.
So next steps.
Right, so in terms of next steps, what we're really looking to do is try and scale this solution not only in Vanuatu, but again, in locations that are similar to Vanuatu globally. What we're trying to do is really create something that is more organic, rather being fixed. What we'd like to see is community adoption. By using a completely open system that is built on a truly decentralized and open infrastructure, we're also hoping to make sure that those community voices and participation become integrated into the way that the system is being iterated and used. And what that means is that eventually, that level of adoption by building in inclusion from step one means that one day you don't need an Oxfam. You don't need a big NGO. Eventually, what you have is a network of community stakeholders that are continually using, iterating, and developing this product for their own needs.
So now, some of the questions. So one of the main questions we get is, what are some of the key challenges we face when we were trying to roll this out? You were going to talk about the super vendor, weren't you?
Yep,
Yeah,
sure, I can. So as you can imagine, going to the remote islands to test a blockchain use case is not without its challenges. And of course, we had things like intermittent internet the system actually worked well, proving the theory that stress testing in an infrastructure challenged environment actually makes your solution more robust. But what was really interesting was the confirmation that this systems gap, that exists with Vanuatu just outside it, just on the margins, meant that even when we wanted to pay back vendors, our plan to pay them back didn't work. It was too slow. Using the formal financial system to try and get those vendors to sign up to bank accounts or receive a check that they could cash out at the bank took a minimum settlement period of 2 days, if not 4 or 5, depending on the quality of their identity documentation and if they had a bank account or not. And this is where we think that, something we were able to iterate on the fly by being based in the community. It's a solution that really grew out of the nature of the inclusion that was embedded in this pilot. So what we found out was there was one vendor in the community that was the largest vendor in the community, also located very much at the center of the community. And she had a key role to play in making sure that these smaller vendors were able to cash out and restock their goods more flexibly closer to where they live without having to go to a bank and carry that identity documentation there. And so we created a super vendor. And what we were doing was we were using the existing network of trust and society that existed at that level and taking one agent in that network to perform the function that a bank in Vanuatu was unable to perform. And that was the role of the super vendor. It was extraordinarily successful, but it again speaks to the fact that when you work with communities and in communities, sometimes those communities become agents of better solutions.
So this is probably my favourite question, and it's, I think, one that sort of applies to this entire space in general, which is, what does blockchain actually bring to this process? Because at the end of the day, you can track digital credits using a database. So, as I said, we used the DAI stablecoin to basically push funds through the platform. Now, by using DAI, what it meant was that the vendors were not reliant on us to remake a payment. When you're normally doing a voucher-based system, all that exists between the vendor and whoever's doing the repayment is a promise. If that person doing the repayment vanishes, the vendor is left out of pocket, which is a very complex and problematic situation for low-income societies. Because the vendor had DAI, if we were to vanish off the face of the planet, that vendor could still go and reimburse for exactly what they're owed. This may seem like a hypothetical situation, but it actually fundamentally changes the regulatory structure under which we operate. Because now we've got less obligations as a money transmitter, as we're just basically just a method for shifting pre-assigned value. And so this massively simplifies the way in which we operate in a country, which makes it far easier to launch this in otherwise completely unfriendly environments for these sort of financial processes that are otherwise very complex. The other one that I guess warrants an offhand mention of why blockchain is the transparency. This is the one that always gets raised in this sort of thing because you get to look at the end-to-end transparency of tracing the funds of donors all the way down to end recipients. And I think it's great, but it's also, I think, to be honest, almost secondary to a lot of the other things we get. The one that I think really excites me most about the blockchain space is the integration capacities you get from using something like a stablecoin like DAI. DAI is an ERC20 compliant coin, which means that anyone who has the capacity in place to work with these sort of tokens can easily integrate into using the exact same payment rail that we've put in place. What this means is that the political threshold for creating collaboration on these sort of projects is basically reduced to zero. Because we're using DAI as a stablecoin, there is absolutely nothing Sempo or Oxfam can do to stop someone else coming in and taking advantage of the same payment processes that we've put in place. We think that this is really important when you look at sort of the history of gatekeeping and political overheads that happen in the humanitarian space, because it basically removes the capacity for this to gatekeep. This is, of course, only the case for a public blockchain. Once you start to talk about fully privatized blockchains, you get some of that those issues back. So that's why we're quite strongly opinionated about the use of the public stablecoin like DAI.
I think those are fair points. For me, also as a practitioner, but as somebody who lives in a region that is very literally distributed across dozens of islands, the borderlessness that you get when you use a cryptocurrency in the payment delivery system as Sempo has with their platform, means that all of a sudden you can confront your enemy, right? And for us, that's climate change. For us, that's climate-related disasters. For us, that's seismic events and volcanoes, things that know no borders. So if you can think about a future where donors or individuals are able to pool funds in DAI and release those funds concurrently as a cyclone rips through 3 or 4 island nations, that's really what we're working towards. Because those solutions are not solved at the margins, in the islands at the end of the world. And that's really where I live and work. And that, again, speaks to the fact that, the status quo doesn't work for everyone. It's fair enough to build systems that serve the needs of the actors who are delivering in very complex, huge contexts, but who is thinking about these communities at the last mile? They are at the most risk of getting left out. They are at the most risk of their islands sinking. But they're also the most open to these sorts of solutions. So being able to build in and with communities that actually are not thinking inside a box of my debit card works, I like my bank, I don't understand why I can't just use the system that I know, means that you can really break open the mold and start to develop something much more organic.
This to me is, I guess, one of my hopes and fears for the blockchain space. If you look at the way payment processes exist around the world right now, they're very, very diverse. I mean, I've never seen so much cash as when I got to Japan. In Australia, we're using exclusively touch-to-pay cards. In America, everyone uses, or there's a lot of solutions like Venmo. Blockchain may be decentralized, but I don't think it's necessarily going to be diverse. If we're not careful, we've got a payment layer that has very strong suggestions around how solutions should look for individual communities. And I think that if we assume that all the solutions look the same and try to inject them into communities, we'll actually end up widening the financial inclusion gap rather than reducing it. And this is something that I think really scares me, and I think something we're going to have to be really careful of.
Yeah.
Which I guess is what makes this somewhat of a unique project in many ways.
Absolutely. And so I think, just as a takeaway, the fact that we were able to take a micro country and a community and a micro economy at that level to solve a macro problem, which is that we should be building tech to confront and break down hierarchies rather than entrenching them through the nature of the solutions that we design, is something that we both believe is extremely powerful. And as we scale this solution and see communities develop and iterate it for themselves, we believe that we'll be working more towards the world that blockchain claimed at the beginning, the world of unleashing and disrupting and including those who are excluded by the systems that we know today.
Awesome. So we've got 2 minutes for questions. Does anyone have a question? Over there? Alejandro?
Yeah, thanks. I'm a big fan of your project, and this is amazing. I'm wondering, do vendors right now have the option, like in practice, to sell the DAI and get local currency? And I know it's a very tricky problem. What are your thoughts on how to improve this?
Yeah, this is one of those cases of like reality and like rhetoric, right? Like just quite honestly. So we tried to, when we were doing some work in Iraqi Kurdistan and Athens, we actually tried to get vendors to sell their DAI. What we found was practically the payment off-ramps in place right now just don't have that user friendliness. Their Coinbase and things like that are still scary looking interfaces. And so the reality is if we didn't have any luck getting vendors to sell their DAI, for that to happen, you basically need a secondary Sempo to come in and say, yes, I'm actually going to provide that bespoke off-ramp. But the good thing is that it's now easier for another organisation to come in and justify doing that because they know there's money in the vendor's hand. So it's something we're not there with yet, and I think that it's going to have to be, once again, tailored.
Yeah, maybe I can add to that. I mean, this is very much a project that's in its infancy, so it's only going to really grow and develop with time, and depending on who we're working with. So to go back to the vendors, in Vanuatu, one of the biggest struggles and challenges that we had with vendors being the only ones with smartphones, even them, only 30% of them had ever used a smartphone before. So to ask somebody like that to, connect to create an account on an exchange using what identity documentation, I'm not sure, and then be able to exchange their cryptocurrency for fiat currency, the Vanuatu Vatu, which I'm not sure is even available on any exchange, was something that we felt was not appropriate. But I feel like, these are shades of gray. It's very possible that you can work in an environment where all it takes is one person or two in a community, not everyone, who is able to connect to an exchange and exchange on behalf of others.
Yeah.
And that's really where you kind of build from the last mile in. And you also adapt and build according to the capacities that actually exist, instead of assuming that everybody should be able to do X, Y, or Z.
Okay.
Hi. I actually have a lot of respect for projects like this because of those assumptions around economics within sort of precarious or otherwise disaster-prone communities. However, one question I would have is, in Australia, for example, they're testing a concept of a cash card for welfare. And I'm curious as to how a situation like this would be kind of control mechanisms by a government or other authority is circumvented if it's distributed through NFC chips and in-card, which kind of on the surface mirrors a bit like a government-issued cash card for welfare.
I'm going to comment on this because I'm
And
from Australia.
you're Australian, yeah.
I mean,
I have to offer clarity for that too, because I know that I'm usually short.
yeah, so I mean, I guess like, I think one of the really important things to realise is that the shape of a technology and in terms of the technical implementation and like what that means to people is largely defined by the top philosophy of like how you're implementing that technology, right? So you can have two very technologically similar systems that are actually performing very different roles inside communities. So the Australian Cash for Welfare card is very controversial right now because the government is really taking it as an approach of a way to cut down on, poor people who are going to spend their money on drugs and alcohol, right? That's why it's so unpopular, is because it's super interventionalist. For us, we very much had the opposite approach of this. We have no opinion on how you're going to spend this. We don't wish to impose that on you. We believe you have the right as a person receiving the money to spend it how you want. And that's part of the glory of crypto, is that once they have the DAI, they can kind of do whatever they want with it. I think what's critical in that is that the philosophy of like how you're actually doing that rather than the technology that's being used in itself. Though I guess you could make some argument that blockchain makes it better.
Yeah, but I think so I was actually in Australia working on this project recently when I heard about this card. And the thing is, that is not really representative of the narrative that exists more on the development humanitarian side, which is really that you should provide people the agency and the freedom to buy what they need instead of trying to control them. And in fact, when you do, you are going to generate so much in administration and control costs that it's going to be self-defeating, at least from a cost-effectiveness perspective. That being said, it doesn't mean that people don't worry about people misusing your funds. So very concretely, in Vanuatu, the question is asked all the time because cash assistance is new. And the way that we confronted that was by saying, listen, as we built the app to the vendors, we said, listen, it's not your fight to tell people what to buy and when, and not to buy a beer or a pack of cigarettes or whatever the non-priority thing was that day. And so what we did was we built a taboo category into the purchase app, into the vendor interface, so that the vendor would just click on taboo, and that we would know that people were buying something that was basically not supposed to be bought, whether it's alcohol or cigarettes or kava in the Pacific. And what that does is that kind of leverages the level of transparency, instant transparency that you can get in order to go back to a donor or somebody else who's worried about the way their money is used to say, listen, we for the first time are not taking somebody's post ex facto opinion for what they spent their money on. We're actually telling you, because we've got eyes on what people spend their money on, that yes, there's a certain amount that's spent on these other goods, but that is human behavior, as opposed to being a failing program.
We've got time for one more question, or are we good, Kelsey? Kelsey's not watching. Cool.
Yeah,
Does
one more.
anyone have any? Yeah, good question over there.
Talked a lot about offboarding, but what about onboarding? And you talked a bit about the smartphone problem that people didn't know about it. Like, what about teaching people how to be their own bank? Like, can you tell us what the problems were and how you try to, because it's a big problem. I mean, in crypto in general, so I guess here as well.
So, I mean, I'm going to hand this to Sandra in a second, but I mean, the one point I want to make is we don't prefer to use this crypto anywhere inside the platform. We use funds that are denominated in Batu. And the app is, we built a lot of the app while working in a refugee camp on the border of Syria. So it was built from the bottom up to be as simple to use as possible. And so we really strip out a lot of that crypto language. We just use it as a back-end infrastructure. But you're better at more.
Yeah, I don't have a straight answer to your question, but I think, and I mean, this is a bit unrelated, but I had a conversation once that stuck in my mind with a senior logistician in the humanitarian sector. And he had done everything. He had done commercial, he had done military. And he said, listen, if you want to build a robust supply chain, you find your most remote and disconnected point and you build it backwards. And what this tells us is that when you, first, don't make assumptions, but also that you confront these issues of digital literacy, terminology, denomination in local currencies, of what roles are appropriate for who to play. Can somebody act as their own bank? And do they have the financial literacy to be able to do so? If they can't, is there somebody else in the community who can fill that gap and has both the financial and digital literacy to do so? So it's not until we start testing in these environments that we start to even create form and shape around what those problems are, and therefore what those solutions are. And it's not until we do that that we also are able to include community voices in defining what those solutions should be. So in the case of Vanuatu, it's mostly that people who are not vendors don't want to be their own bank. In fact, they're very happy to use a card and not have to count anything at all until it's finished, and then it's done. On the vendor side, however, the capacity to be able to cash out others, so to act as an ATM for others, had the unintended, intangible consequence of elevating that vendor's social status within the community, which is fascinating because all of a sudden she became instrumental in the way the program functioned. And in a post-disaster scenario, that is the switch between being a recipient or a beneficiary to being an agent in the recovery process.
Awesome, I think that's all we have time for. So thank you very much.
Thank you, guys.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Here, so I gotta take off this.